Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final installment of Reading Culture's series on heroism and the literary concept of the hero. We began this series back in January by considering what a hero was and how the word is defined, at least in the English language. We saw that its origins come from ancient Greek, where a hero was simply someone favored by the gods with immense strength and ability. It had no ethical or moral dimension. We see how eventually this becomes the concept of the noble martial character, right? Still related to that strength and that warlike aspect, but now with the idea of nobility added in. We see that this is eventually extended to all forms of life, not just the martial, right? Anyone who performs some kind of admirable deed or noble action can be considered a hero. And finally, that it is used in the literary space as a way of naming the protagonist of a particular story with whom the audience is meant to identify. All of these things are pieces, though. They don't really tell us, perhaps, what is the function of the hero in literature? How does it work? How has it changed? We began with Plato, and with him we entered the cave. Throughout this series, we've been looking at scrawlings on a wall, individual actions by characters, whether it's Henry before the gates of Harfleur or Arthur before his queen, or Beowulf in the Hall of the Dragon. We've looked at bits of heroic or, as it may be, not heroic action. But we need to ascend. We need to get out of the cave to the world of the forms. What do I mean by that? I mean, we're talking not about individual plot elements that may or may not be termed as heroic action, but rather we're looking at the concept of heroism in literature itself. What are the patterns, the overall patterns that we see? Well, this may be difficult to unravel. Aristotle may help us with this. His philosophy of the golden mean may help us analyze these characters. After all, is a hero simply that character which does and performs actions which I personally, as the reader, agree with? The term would have no meaning then. It would fall into dissolution and subjectivity and relativity entirely. However, we still are left with a problem, right? We can't simply say, well, the character defeats a monster. That's heroic. Is it always heroic? Is it worth simply saying that because the hero fights the villain, that is simply all that heroism means in literature? Is it not maybe more than that? We began with a very uh, ancient tradition of oral tales from the Mi'kmaq people. The very compiler claimed that there were no heroes in these stories, but that is a matter of definition, isn't it? We see characters there acting in ways that we will see repeated in other much more modern and more European texts. Again, the defeating of the monster, right? The protecting of the community, or the resistance to external force and violence. We looked at a very unlikely hero, if we want to call him that, a very passive hero, you could say, in Faluti's convocation address, an intellectual in a communist concentration camp. All he did was give some lectures in the evenings, but it saved lives, though not the one that he lamented being unable to save. He's a victim. Can one be a hero and a victim at the same time? Are these mutually exclusive categories? Perhaps. But we'll see that the same patterns come again and again, right? This pattern of sacrifice, of toil, right? Of putting oneself in the place of another. We looked at also this idea that what is a hero if not the product of a narrative fabric? Right? A hero is not an empirical category. It's not a distinction that we can measure and quantify. It exists in narrative, whether in reality or in literature. And so we looked at the tale of the Cave of Kai, right? How heroes and tales of heroism must be perpetuated by people, by story. That if it's lost, locked away in the Cave of Kai beyond the mists of time, then that's nothing to us. Right? But it's the particles that cling to the strings of the harp. That is what lasts. But what are these particles? What clings to the harp? Those things form patterns. Again, the hero overcoming the monster, right? The descent into the underworld. The flaw in character, which leads to the fall of the man or the fall of the realm. These things cling on. They can be played with. We looked at Farmer Giles of Ham, right? The dragon versus the knight, but it's not really a knight, is it? Right? It's not the ordinary hero, and it's amusing. It's funny. It's instantiating the same patterns, but its particularity is in having fun with those patterns and overturning them. It's the inversion. If you know that knights kill dragons, then the farmer overcoming the dragon when the knights cannot is amusing. That's why identifying these patterns is so important. I had a conversation with Mr. Jonathan Pajot about the symbolism of the saint's life of Saint Margaret, the dragon slayer. She overcomes the dragon not through violence, as perhaps a more masculine hero like Beowulf, but through an internal strength and fortitude, to use one of the virtues from Aristotle's Meme. And similarly, we looked at the martyr hero, not only in St. Margaret, but in Thomas More. How is Thomas More a hero? He doesn't do much. In fact, his primary distinction is not doing things, not signing what he is supposed to sign, not saying what he is supposed to say, not thinking what he is supposed to think by society and the powers that be. The author himself calls him a hero of selfhood. What kind of a hero is that? Is it a legitimate form? If so, what is the point? What is the relationship of the hero to others? Is hero simply a distinction that we, the reader, make? What about heroes who are proclaimed as such in the text themselves? In Shakespeare's Henry V, he is clearly acclaimed a hero throughout, not only by characters within it, but also by the chorus itself. And yet, there are these troubling aspects. Right? There are soldiers blaming the king for their bad end. There are characters lamenting the destruction of life and of society caused by Henry's wars. There are those that claim that not only is he not a hero, but that there are no heroes in Shakespeare, only people. Is a hero a person? Is it more than a person? Assumedly, it's not less. How distinct is the hero? If we call everything a hero, does the term lose significance? If we have no common basis to say that is noble, that is admirable, if it's all subjective, how can we have a definition at all? Maybe someone reads Henry V and is a pacifist and says that character cannot be a hero. Maybe someone reads Henry V as a pro-war hawk who says, well, of course, how could he be anything but a hero? But what does Shakespeare think? Well, we can only know by looking at the text. What is the structure? He wins in the end, but at cost. Is the sacrifice to himself or is the sacrifice for others? And how does that compare with Arthur in Tennyson's Idylls of the King? Arthur, it seems, is willing to sacrifice himself for others, to fight for the weak and the downtrodden. But what does it come to? He asks a standard which his knights don't meet. Perhaps they cannot meet. The kingdom falls after the knights fall. The morality of the knights, the fate of the knights, the souls of the knights, That is the soul of Camelot, and with them falls the dream. Arthur goes off to Avalon, received back into the sea from whence he came, having utterly failed. The kingdom is doomed to be conquered by the Saxons. But his heroism, is that called into question? Does a hero need to be successful? Is victory, in the end, really a part of this admirability and this nobility of character? What is Arthur's character? Is he beyond character? Is he simply a mythical construct? Does he exist in the mind of Tennyson alone? Or does he exist in the mind of the characters in the poem? Arthur himself is an ideal, it seems. But if he's entirely an ideal, then shouldn't he succeed? Shouldn't there be something there that wins out in the end? Perhaps. But Arthur, again, is an instantiation of a pattern, right? The king who comes from outside the center, who seeks to build it up, right? The rotting from the center, which collapses the head, the rotting of the body and of the limbs, which challenges the head and brings it down, right? Again, the king as the head of the people that must sacrifice itself for the rest. But what about the other characters? What about Lancelot? Lancelot is utterly loyal to his lady and false to his king. Is he a hero in that story? He's certainly martial. He's considered to be noble in many ways, but what about this admirability? Where would he fall in Aristotle's mean? Mallory describes him as the most fierce in battle, but the most gentle in hull. This is chivalry. It's what it is. It's the joining of two opposites, of the brutal virtues of the warrior and the gentle virtues of the courtier. It's an entirely new construct that doesn't exist in the world of more ancient tales. And perhaps it doesn't exist in modern literature either. We looked at W.H. Audin's Shield of Achilles, where written on that shield is not the story that we find in Homer, but something far darker and lacking in hope. Perhaps there is no modern hero, for the modern world rejects the very idea of nobility and admirability, or at least rejects the same standard for them. But how can we analyze text for heroes then? Can we do such a thing at all? Perhaps these patterns that we see, the defeating of the creature and the monster by the hero, is simply the product of a tradition that is only now fit for children, parody, and satire. We read Jabberwocky. We see Lewis Carroll having fun with this Anglo-Saxon tradition that had been rediscovered in his time. These ancient archaic words describing the beating or defeating of some mythical beast by the young hero. But that pattern's still there. That's actually a very common use of it. It's the language in that poem that is particular. But of course, we never get to know the hero. Who defeats the Jabberwock? Who is he really? What is the source of his nobility? We read Geoffrey Chaucer's Gentilesse, where he argues that while nobility in terms of blood, rank, or the aristocratic kind of nobility can be inherited, virtue cannot. The virtues of Aristotle's mean are not passed on hereditarily. After all, then they would all be heroes. And finally, we look to Beowulf. What could be a more traditional hero? With a strength of 30 men in each hand, he defeats Grendel, Grendel's mother, and ultimately the dragon at the cost of his own life. What does it say that his kingdom comes to nothing, destroyed in the ashes of intertribal war? Again, does this call into question his heroism? Does it matter that he failed? Is that significant for how we view him as a character? Does this mean that there's no basis, really, for admiring him at all? Is his nobility based in his failed effort, or is it not there due to some kind of character flaw? Now, there are many kinds of literary hero, which we have not had time to look at in this series. There's the tragic hero, with its origins in Aristotle's Poetics, who has the tragic flaw that causes him to commit some kind of sin, which results in his own tragic end. Right? There's, of course, the anti-hero, right? The hero who, while functioning in many ways according to the pattern of the hero, nevertheless is inverting some of those patterns as well, perhaps acting like the monster than entirely the hero. But these are, in some ways, not the point of this discussion. The point is really to think about, what does the hero look like when it manifests itself in culture through literature? And we've seen that it looks immensely different. We have the most warlike of characters, from Beowulf and Henry V, to the most passive, like Margaret, Moore, and Faluti. We've seen characters that fit very much into more civilized and modern morality, like Arthur, and characters like those from the Tales of the Six Worlds, which do not, very much so. We have characters that would seem to be manifesting patterns that any culture would claim to be laudable, such as loyalty and courage. But others, where perhaps the culture they lived in was very different from our own. Perhaps the actions of Henry in war were normal for his time, and in no way unadmirable or ignoble, but yet would be violations of our own modern culture's sensibilities very much. We've seen protagonists, certainly, of many stories. Perhaps sometimes the reader is meant to identify with them, and perhaps sometimes they are not. However, the real key thing here is to understand that these have different instantiations in different cultures, whether it's Mi'kmaq culture or Elizabethan England or 20th century North America. These are very different kinds of cultures. And so when we read culture, in other words, when we read text and see how culture affects it, we can find all kinds of things here, right? A warlike culture like the Greeks is focused on strength, right? In the Christian era, this becomes more moral and more ethical, right? The battle is interior, but also exterior as well. The hero fights monsters and wars, but he also fights within himself. Maybe Beowulf doesn't do that. Right? Maybe that's why he's more in these ancient heroes than in a more modern tradition. But ultimately, there are still patterns in reality that we can see. The idea of a point of view, right, the hero, the protagonist of the story, must exist. And it makes sense that by identifying with it, we would more easily enter into the literature, and that identification in itself will make us sympathize with them in a way that we'll see them as more laudable, more admirable, and be a hero in that sense, right? It's an elemental part that there needs to be conflict for there to be a story. If that's external, then that looks like a more ancient hero fighting the monster. But as we looked at, right, that can be internal as well. There are patterns of nobility which manifest themselves in all cultures. Again, loyalty, courage, these are not culturally determined. They are actually a part of how reality lays itself out. If we praised cowardice, if we praised betrayal, society couldn't function. And so these patterns elevate themselves up out of the cave, you could say, so that we can perhaps, while not absolutely defining what a hero is in literature, say it's not so easy to define it so specifically, but I can tell you what the pattern is. What is the pattern of the hero in literature? Right? It's that courageous overcoming of the obstacle. I finished my talk on Beowulf by saying that he was a man, and that for many is sufficient tragedy. Well, perhaps you could say that for all the characters we've looked at. They're human beings. And that for us may be sufficient heroism.